Okay, so thank you for agreeing and for being here on this panel today and to share insights around publishing. Can we perhaps start with what is a photo book to start with, and what really about the form of a photo book is so engaging to perhaps each of you, and why did you decide that to be the creative practice?
Sounds good. It's an interesting conversation. We've been talking about that a little bit in our workshop as well. And we spoke a little bit about it when we all met to figure out what we're going to do over here on this panel today. And I think the interesting, for me, what's interesting is what the photo book can be. I'd like to suspend it into the imagined formats possible. I mean, traditionally, of course, we're all familiar with the idea of photographs in a book. And that has stayed on, which is a great thing. But I think it's also about, in my mind, I think about what the photograph can be also today. And as much as photography is being expanded and played with and explored with, I think that allows for a lot more on what the photo book can be. And in our library we have a lot of photo books that are not necessarily working with only photography. And for me, it is about the visual that can be imagined, the visual that can be provoked, that also allows for maybe a book of text or poetry to even go into the photo book. I mean, traditionally speaking, there are photographs, but also archives have entered into photography very, very substantially. We have, and within the archive now, you have photograph, but you have ephemera, you have documents, you have screenshots that are visual, which Steve was going to talk about. And I think more than what the photo book is, I think the photo book can be any world that you can suspend into a visual imagination. But,
Okay. Is this working?
Yeah.
Yes. You have to hold it quite close.
Right here.
Not closer. I'll say something from the point of view of a graphic designer that makes books, so it's maybe a bit different. But maybe the first thing is, I think the photo book and as an object has changed quite a lot. Maybe before the classic photo book with images on glossy paper with a hardcover, which now more looks like maybe an album or maybe catalog, is something that we've moved away from. So they still exist, of course, but as a photo book today, I would imagine that we've moved to something where the object, as in the material we do it with, is really important. So this is also what I do and what we were trying to do this week. And what I love of photo books is that you can make it into an object that has a different feel. So that means the size, the paper, the binding, the soft cover or hard cover really becomes something that relates to the project, and to find a form that really conveys this story through the materials is what, for me, makes a book special. So this doesn't necessarily need to be just photographs. Of course, there can be text and other things. But and then the last thing is, I think the book really allows everybody to look at the work on its own and like at its own pace. So for me, that's the book today.
For me, I think I really like the way Ashika put that what can a photo book be, rather than trying to define what it is. And it kind of gives us a way to take free from the existing structure. And even though we should focus, but an exhibition works differently, slideshow works differently. And book predominantly focuses on the physicality and tangibility of it. And there is a certain way that as a medium reacts and works. So it is more of a transfer of medium to an extent, understanding what the tangibility of the book as a form puts forward. So you would not be able to do the same in an exhibition, but you could translate the whole work into an object that is with people all over, always, because you don't get to have an exhibition with you or a slideshow with you. Unless the artist is the friend, but books are a very important document as such, and it has always been so pluralistic. So using photographs as medium to approach that itself is quite interesting. And right now, taking free from the traditional methods of page 1, 2, 3 doesn't exist anymore. So that makes it more interesting and opens up the venue to experiment a lot more. And I will make a big copy of the book because I have 10, 20 photos. So I've made a book without no photos, and it's photo data, so things are changing.
I shouldn't have gone last. You've kind of said it all, and I totally agree with everything that's been said. And the fact that the photo book didn't disappear when the internet arrived is a real tribute, let's say, to what it is and what we all love about it. And I think, everyone said something different. And perhaps to add to those things, which I all agree with, that it needs to be an object. We don't just want it to be a vehicle to hold photographs. Those kind of books still do exist, and they're rather boring and usually quite expensive. I think long term it's a really powerful legacy for people's work and for the history of photographers. So, yeah. And I suppose the other thing that might lead us on to another question or conversation is that the photo book is not just about a photographer, it's about a collaboration between different people. So you have an editor, you have a publisher, you have a designer, and you have a photographer, and then you have a printer. So this is actually a collaboration, and that's also very interesting about working with the photo book.
Thank you.
I just have, I just wanted to add to that, and I feel that maybe we don't call it the photo book anymore. Maybe we just call it a book, and then we see what emerges from that. Because I think with, maybe to a certain degree with all our practices, I'm taking the liberty to say that, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I think photography is not a medium isolated in the photograph anymore. And so why should the photo book become so isolated as well? So I guess it's a confusion. Do we suspend and liberate the photo book to incorporate others, or do we let go of the photo book to become just the book, and then it can be anything that it chooses to be?
Can I say something to
Yes.
that? I mean, this is a really interesting point, and I have to remember back to in the UK when we have an arts council who funds things, and it used to have a photography department. And then around early 1990, photography got taken into fine art.
Right.
Okay, it's a wonderful idea, we want to be there. However, most of the funding from photography disappeared. So,
No, we
it's
need the
like-
funding. We definitely.
It's really, I think it's quite a radical and interesting idea, and of course we want to be thought of alongside all the other things. But what do you do about this other problem?
Yeah. That's an important problem. That's a serious issue.
I think maybe just to add to that, I mean, and we were speaking about this earlier, that it's fascinating to think of the photo book as somehow liberating, and one thing that is coming out is the idea of imagination, or what the template is or should be and what it can be. And as a writer, the book is actually the most terrifying thing, and it totally constrains one. So I think in photographic practices, if there is something about the book that's actually enabling imagination and freedom, that seems to be really fascinating. But also the sense of play, perhaps, with the materiality of the book itself, which in conventional books, one does not necessarily think of what paper are we going to use, what is it actually going to look at, what is design going to be, how is it going to be received by the reader. And coming back, perhaps, Anna, to your point on collaborative processes, I mean, I think it would be great if we can speak a little more about that, because with photographers also, one is working in isolation perhaps, and and it's something that we find in book production. It's a big challenge then too, because one has to be able to communicate through the various channels of the production. But what goes into actually making the photo book, with designers, with editors?
Do you want to
No,
answer?
you start. You'll yes.
Okay, a lot goes into it. I think sometimes one could think that, oh, it's just a simple book, it's just small, there's just a few pages, there's just a few images. We did that in a couple of days or weeks. I would say mostly, the most books I've done over the past 15 years have taken between a year and 3 years to be completely done, and that is without the production of the actual photographs or content by the artist. And that is, I'll just say briefly, I've told this also during the workshop, but maybe it's interesting to hear. There's a lot of people that are involved in each project. That's also what makes it so fascinating and such a nice and inspiring job to do, is because every book comes up with a group of people that collaborate at different moments. So there's a very close collaboration between the designer and the photographer, usually, not always, but that's the ideal setup, and what I would say is the best or the better version. Then there is the publisher, who can or cannot be very involved, depending on the size, on the setup, or whatever. I would say it usually starts with funding. So you mentioned this before. We spend a lot of time in trying to set up first a document that can be sent out to even look for the funding. And the same goes for the publisher. So it's always quite difficult, because for the publisher you need the money, and for the money you need the publisher. So this kind of thing sounds funny, but it can take forever, and sometimes some books never even happen because of this. So, and the funding often also keeps going on while you're already making the book, because we've decided to make it. So there's this, and then there is the publisher, the designer, the photographer. There is the decision if there's going to be text or not. So that's another very interesting topic, which I'm not going to go into right now. Maybe somebody else can do that later. I found that a fascinating part, but that then means that the text is chosen or written. I live in Switzerland, so it's usually translated, at least in one other language, if not more. And then the whole part of the editorial design, of choosing the layout, the sequence, the typeface, making the paper dummies of what we've done during the workshop. That's a long process of back and forths with a lot of options that come in. So it's not just like we do one dummy and then it's done. And then there's a person, usually can be related to the printer, that prepares the images for being produced as a book. So that's not the same as preparing images for exhibition. And then there is the printer and the binding, and that gets done, and then we get the books, and then they need to be distributed, and the publisher and the distribution and the communication and the website and selling them and stocking them and shipping them. So it sounds very long, so sorry for this, but maybe it helps to know that there is all these steps, and in all these steps there is people and deadlines and money involved. And so when it takes 2 years, it's because it's quite complex. And that makes it interesting and fascinating, but sometimes also difficult to manage all the steps, depending on where we are, what we're doing, the content of the book. And this, I would say, goes for most of these kind of projects. I don't know if that helps to have like a bit of an overview.
Yes, and perhaps maybe Steve, would you like to say something about what it was for you to work in the production of, in actually making a photo book to translate the, yeah.
I mean, it was not a collaborative process. It was a collaborative process because as part of another workshop, there is other people giving inputs of how we could build that book. But in terms of the actual production, there's obviously the printer involved. I can't have a printer at home. So it was a collaborative process to some extent, but it was for me all in isolation, just getting within there. And in terms of design, I couldn't really have a designer on board because since the screenshot, there were like specific design elements that I had to use, and I can't really move away from it. Facebook has to have a certain shade of blue. I can't be like, this doesn't work, can you just push the blue, doesn't work. So I couldn't lose on the integrity of certain, and the designs were kind of restricted in the work that I was doing. So I had to keep a certain font size, all the specific, since I remade all those screenshots, so it was not also visual, so I had to individually place those small arrows, the 3 dots that you see in the mails, all the small ones that are a profile picture. So all those decisions are anyway made by Meta. So they have all those design decisions made for me already. So I had to use Arial size 8, that's it. So if I move away from that, it kind of rejects the whole idea of what screenshots and me posting those photographs. So in the current book, at least I couldn't really collaborate with another designer. In that case, I had to change Instagram's layout or anything. So it was not a one-person thing that was agreeing to. But in the same way, when I started working with photographs in the workshop, it was a lot different as an approach itself. So so there was no restrictions as such that as I had in the previous project, but this had a lot more avenues I could collaborate with. The process didn't shut itself down, not allowing people to be part of it, except for editing. I had people telling me about how this could work and how the eye reads it and the ease of flow. In the previous book, it really broke away from the traditional photo books. So to some extent, I had intense amount of freedom, also restriction. Because since no one has seen something else, I can do whatever I want. Be like, this is what you get. So, but also there was these design restrictions that I had to adhere to. And that is not taking me, but playing by the rules, I would say. So the premise was set in terms of design in the last scene book, whereas in a photo book, it's a lot more fluid, I would say.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And maybe I think it. Oh, sorry.
No, I wanted to just say there was an interesting thing what Steve spoke about, which we also encountered in the workshop, which was, one part of it, of course, is the pragmatics and the logistics of the production process, and I think Anne kind of described the length of that in great detail, which was very helpful. Within India, when you're working with photo books, it's largely self-published, and so to imagine that you are the photographer, you are the author very often, as in Steve described, you are the designer. You have to develop the relationship with the printer, you've got to figure out how to make it happen, you've got to take care of the sales, and you have to be your own distributor. So it is an overwhelming range of personalities that you adapt and adopt to. And very often you don't know what you're doing within that, because these are, it's a fairly unstructured space over here. So everyone has different formats in which this works. I think the idea of like self-publishing and actually being able to think about making the book distribute by itself. We've had some big help, like photographers like Saurabh Hura, actually took on self-publishing, and suddenly everyone was like, this is over a decade ago, where Saurabh was just like, I'm making this book, and I'm going to put it up on Facebook, and if people want, they're going to get it from there. And everybody wrote back to Saurabh in I think 3 days, and everyone was like, I want a copy. And that allowed us to think of that possibility. You know, you have photographers like Ritesh Chandani who has such a unique way of approaching distribution, where he actually decided to make this book, he put the announcement out, and he literally goes and drops the book off to as many homes as he can, individually in person, which is an impossible task when you think about it. But I think it creates very new, very different kind of interactions and engagements, and the book then becomes kind of like a very unique way of looking at how photography is also creating its own community. These people could be photographers who are buying these books, but like now we actually have people who are outside of photography who are interested in these books, and I think that is really. For me, that's where we need to go for, you know. And also to talk about the process, I think we had a little bit of that experience in the workshop as well, because like the happy birthday image for Steve, you know, and Sarah, we had a book which was looking at cinema, and I think she was thinking about the images kind of on their own, and then she had these tickets from the cinema hall that belonged to her family, and suddenly you have these objects in front of you, and we were like, why don't we paste it on top? Why don't we bring this other material in? Why don't we write what you're saying about, you know, your memories with this? And the minute I think that is possible to have in something like a book, because these conversations come out in something like a book. When you're thinking about it in an exhibition, traditionally, immediately your mind would go into, okay, so I'll put all this information in my artist statement, which is a different thing, which I had an entirely different issue with altogether. But the book becomes a really nice way where the artist statement is not an explanation of your work, where you imagine text to exist as work itself. You know, the text is not there to explain your image is not there to correlate to the text. They can be separate entities and they can work with each other. And even small things like cropping your image. We've had, there was a big conversation on should we crop this image. And I remember there was this one image with Steve's work, which was nicely placed on a page and was looking nice and clean and beautiful. And suddenly we were like, but the ceiling has so much texture, we need to crop in, we need to go in. And he was like, okay, cool, let's do this. So I think you're more giving with your images. You're more open to saying, what does this image need? And not to say that this page is going to show my photograph, but that this page is going to be the photograph. And I think that's when you realize that you are more open and more free to let go of how fragile you hold the photograph. And I think that's really where the play part of it comes in, you know, and it happens with printers, it happens with all kinds of engagements. I mean, when we were printing Goethe, I talk about this particular incident repeatedly, but I never tire of it. So sorry guys, you'll have to hear it again. But you know, when we were printing Uma Bista's work, it's looking at menstruation cycles, it's looking at patriarchy, and so one segment of her work has this deep red that is present in the work. And I was sitting with the printer. The other advantage of having unofficial structures of photo books is that you push your way through. You're not working with formal printers because you're trying to like wiggle your way through DIY systems. And we were trying to print this book, and I needed the red to be deep. I needed it to be intense. But we were working with the printer, and it would go into pinks or it would go into oranges, and I was like, no, it needs to be red. And how do we do it? And it just was completely impossible, and I, of course, don't know the technicalities. So I said, okay, let's take a break. I sat down with the printer and I explained what the work was. And I said, she is pissed off. She's pissed off because the first time she got her period, for 14 days, she was shut in a room. And she's angry about it. So it can't go orange, it can't go pink, it has to be red. How do we do this? And that's when you realize, because they know what they're doing. And he was just like, okay, give me 5 minutes, let me figure this out. And he got the perfect right. So sometimes it's not, you don't need the technicalities of a language, but you just need to be able to talk about what's moving us. You need to be able to talk about why we're making what we're making. And they need to kind of embody that. They need to understand the intention of that. And I think that's where things you don't expect happen. So I just want to kind of bring that in because it's part of like building community, part of play, part of what are we doing with the photo book and why are we doing the photo book? I mean, is it a nice boost to like our sense of, oh, I made this work and it looks really pretty, or is it something else? And those things will translate, and we need all of those intentions to work if we're building a world of books. So just to kind of put that in.
Can I just add to that?
Yeah.
I think what's been said about this idea of self-publishing, it's really interesting and quite radical, the idea of self-publishing, and obviously a powerful way of beating the system, let's say. But what you've just said illustrates to me how important it is to still have this sense of collaboration with the printer, with the designer, with the people. So even, and I think you've quite successfully pulled together something where you are working with different people, started almost, off your own back. So I think when people are thinking about self-publishing, they could also still think about collaboration, and collaboration with peers and in every group of photographers. If you're in a school or in a class or in a workshop, there are people who can do design better than others, let's say. Yeah. And there are people who know the technical things better than others. And the other thing that I think is really, really important, actually, and maybe not so interesting to us photographers and designers, is the idea of the PR. And if you get some, and again, that's a skill. So, your person went around the houses, that's a great idea. I've heard a lot of people doing that, that's really good PR technique. But actually it takes somebody with skill to work out those ideas. And I think that it's worth some money investment of even a small kind to actually get someone for each thing to do some very good PR.
Thank you for this. I mean, I think there are so many things that are coming to mind, but I want to, like, one thing specifically about this example with the printer is I think very often we think of these jobs as sort of compartmentalized, right? I'm the photographer, I'm now the editor, I'm now the book designer, I'm now the DTP person, and I'm now the printer. But like, how do we actually explain the work? And it's taking me back to one of the shows on It's Time to See to Be Seen, and it's kind of like, at least this particular example, right, that it's a world making in one sense, that it's what would happen actually, and I don't know why, but it feels like it's a good space to even talk about like the gender roles in book publishing, like what would have happened if we had more female printers, or like print especially in this country, right, distributors, printers who are. But it would be very interesting if it's possible to maybe speak about how does one fund a book, because both as in terms of self-publishing, but also in terms of, I think, as a publisher, how do you actually, what is the process? Does one save up money as if one is to self-publish? Do you borrow? Do you crowdfund? Do you, as a publisher, do you apply for grants as organizations? Especially with India, UK, like are those kinds of opportunities available now, given the whole like decolonial, stress? But any thoughts?
I think you should.
And as well, I think most importantly, I'm not sure that you should use Europe and the UK as an example, because I think we're going in a very difficult direction. I'd like to say also that in the UK, we don't seem to have many women in the business of printing or in book publishing. We have one woman directing a book publishing company, that's Hannah Watson at Trolley, who's a great person to work with. I can't remember seeing any women printers. I'm sure they must be there.
I know one.
Okay. So that's a shame, yeah. But raising money, the problem is there's not... the way Europe and the UK has done it is the publishers are charging the photographers money to do it. And that's because the market hasn't really been created, I suppose. So they're kind of, it can only be described as artificially stimulating it. And I'm not sure what it's such a good idea, except of course we've got a lot of photo books, and a lot of them are very good. I'm not saying that they're still selecting, they're not just publishing anything, there's still a process of selection. So, you know, they are choosing really good books to publish, it's not that. But photographers have to raise the money. So, putting that aside, whatever one thinks about it, I think if you're if it's your first book, photographers have quite a lot of success in crowdfunding. So they'll say, I'll sell 100 books with a print, and you know that works quite well. I think if you have a few books out, you can't do that. People are thinking, why are you doing that? And they're right to think that, and that's the problem with this marketplace. But we have quite a few grants that you can apply for, and that's something I would do. And then there are a very few publishers who will pay for everything, and certainly someone like myself who's been in the business for a long time should only be looking for those kind of things, really. However, if you work in a university, universities have funds, there's the Arts Council. It's not, none of it is massive, but it's feasible. But I don't think it, I have never agreed to put personal money into a book, but I know an awful lot of people who do. I don't have money to put into a book, but I know an awful lot of people who've been compelled to do that because they want that book so much. So I don't know, I know other people, I don't know how you feel about that idea of raising money.
To come out.
So in terms of after putting this book into just people asking whether printed it, oh shit, I didn't think pro. I mean, if I go and I still sit in the fifth one. So it's been kind of interesting, but also another point, like, that's how when in Europe, CPB is totally different, where the talk was creative publishers. But from America, this is impossible to think of that situation. More than 90 days social capital capacity, which makes the knowledge very stagnant in certain place or group or community, which doesn't really go against those whole areas where the work is actually accessible to people. So in that case, it's an introduction of us, right? The setup was you have to price high. So I still thought that idea, but how do I price this better than the producers mass? Should I just immediately go, say this has 200 literatures, try it by it. Should I really go about, should I make sure knowing so much of what goes into production, can I hack a way around it to make it accessible? So in that case, production, it's a double work of yours to make, not just go to the existing structure, which is very stuck up in certain senses, but to make it more feasible and approachable, book as a goes to people by education. I can be part of the process, I can't one piece of it. So there is, I don't think it's a photography problem, it's not that point, it's a psychological issue, which we deal with in every life. So it's, even though, let's say, one person is easy money to reach, and there's another person is not easy to go. So that's the disadvantage that we deal with. So it's a whole different ballgame, and I've been, since I've been in education since I was introduced to these photographs and reviews also, not many reviewers have seen as photos either, and how can they go to this because it's not I should show you or teach you, we should have the same access to it. So those are the things that I would try to navigate through as a process, because it's easy to just, because it's a book that I produce, it doesn't really cost me as much as money. Because I got a sheet, I got a hardboard, I got a needle, I got a letter, so I cut out all the other written bindings of the folding of the papers, so only cost was leather sheet was just 120 rupees, I got 2 sheets of it. And the printing for one page of mine was 150 rupees. So the whole one production was able to cut it down to 500 rupees. Whereas another person did it give it out to someone, and it's easy to pump up the price. So it is a very valuable role as an artist of how you make it accessible and also to the public, and it's just not a photography or those photos were ready and accurate enough to spend thousands in photos because there are people that are needed by such a great book. So that is on a long that I would want to address this and to produce my own books in a larger scale to make it bigger. That is, I don't know, it's easy to fulfill where I function as a psychiatrist.
Say something?
You must.
So I must. So I think it's a really interesting conversation. And why are we making these books? Like, who is supposed to be able to buy them? Who is supposed to be even able to see them? Yes, it needs the money, but sometimes if the money is the reason why it's not happening, maybe it should happen some other way. And maybe one interesting thing is to hear that I totally agree with Anna, and I would say Switzerland is not better than the UK. It's a similar setup, the whole of Europe. Publishers ask for money to not only produce the book, but to even exist. So the photographers seem to be at a point where they need a book so much to even continue their career that they're willing to not only give away their whole project, but to even look for the whole money, which seems to be a totally crazy way of approaching this. So I also tend to be aware of this, and when we try and look for a publisher and for money to make these books happen, I tend to go against this as much as possible and find publishers that at least participate in helping to find the money and not ask extra fees on top, which is something that is happening, which is a bit disturbing. But maybe one thing I wanted to add is, so there's a lot of self-publishing also happening in Europe, and I think the reason is because sometimes it's just much easier to actually make that book come out, because if you're just spending so much time in looking for a publisher that will never even reply to an email, you might as well just do it yourself. So I wouldn't see the self-publishing as something that is less good because there's no money and there's no publishers. It's just another way of making it happen, and sometimes it's even better. And there is this self-publish, be happy. They're from, I mean, they're based in Italy now, but they used to be in the UK. And it kind of makes sense. There's things that can just be done maybe quicker. And why is even a publisher still here would be another panel discussion. But one thing also maybe to hear is that it's not because in Europe we have more funding, we do, and we are privileged and we can apply to maybe more institutions, and we have an easier or more possibilities. It's also there a really lot of homework to be done, and not many people give a lot of money, so you're asking everybody individually for little bits to put it together, and as said before, it can take years. And also, even if you get your book funded and you're selling it, maybe it's interesting to hear that it can never be sold at a price that is so high, which would be crazy, to actually cover the costs. So the cost of producing a book, even simply, and also if the designer's not paid a lot, and even if the publisher's not taking a share, the book must remain in a price in the market where it's sold, that people can actually buy it, because we not want to make books become something for just an even more crazy high elite. You can't make a book so that nobody can buy anymore. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, I think, wherever we are, is that the price of the book, even if the 500 copies are all sold, they would not cover the cost of all the people that have worked for it, even if they've not been very much paid. So I think this is, a lot of people don't know this. So So when they are surprised that you're at the end still doing a crowdfunding because you still haven't got your money, this just happened to a book we've been making for the past years. And we've got some funding, but we didn't finish. And the artist said, okay, it's Christmas and I'm just going to sell some prints. And she did that on her own and just start saying, okay, if you want to buy a print and you help support the book. And people were like, yeah, but you got funding. It's like, yeah, but it's not enough. She's not even been paid and she's been working for 20 years. So I think it helps to kind of understand that everybody's very passionate about making this happen, and that's the good part. And but it's not really a sustainable business, even if there's a publisher.
I'll echo with that. It's a sinking ship, but it's a beautiful sinking ship, so we're all in love with it. But I do. There are a couple of things I want to maybe counter with the panel, just because, firstly, I'm very, very happy that I can think of many women publishers in India and within South Asia who are actually publishing. The biggest of this in Nepal, we have the Nepal Picture Library running, with Nayantara at the helm. I'd like to put Offset in the mix. We have Kanike in Bangalore, we have Editions Jojo, we have Photo Inc. They're all run by women. So that was a really good kind of reminder in my head to say, not bad, guys. We're doing okay.
And in Chennai, Tara Books itself.
And yeah, I mean, we do have Tara right here as well. So I do think in that sense it's something. It was a little moment of acknowledgement to say that we're doing okay on that front at least. It doesn't mean that surviving is any easier, of course, but also to kind of place. A lot of self-publishing is being done by, men and women. We're still not looking at enough queer narratives coming in. There's so much that's still missing, and we need to fill up a ton of voids, that still exist, and hopefully more and more shall come in. But, Steve, even what you spoke about, I think we really devalue our labor into this. Yeah. Yes, you could buy these 2 sheets, 2 leather sheets, and you sat down and you stitched the book on your own. You had to go and build a relationship with a printer, and you developed a work, right? So maybe the material cost of it is 1 because you made 5 books, but tomorrow, even if you choose to do a small edition of 50, are you even small things like auto fairs, like how do we make this sustainable? How do we make it in such a way that, yes, you can make this 1 book, but you can imagine the next, let's just say, right? Because otherwise, how are we gonna grow and evolve the medium becomes a very, very important part. And we have very little funding. Photography to kind of be allowed to exist in the artistic space is still a phenomena that we're making sense of, we're pushing for it. So the photo book coming within that is just like, people just don't know what to do with it. The Al-Qazi Foundation, of course, has continued to have, they're the only people with a photo book grant, in the entire region. And so photographers really have to kind of think through this and say, okay, maybe for this particular, maybe to shoot I get this 1 grant, and then maybe to process and to produce I get this other grant, and it's still hyper erratic, which is great, which is not ideal, but now that we know it's not perfect on either either part of the world, it's nice to kind of feel reassured by that. But I think it's also really important on why we're doing the book. We were really lucky. We got some funding from Global Media. We had Photo South Asia support us for the printing of different editions of Guftagu. But our second book, Sisno, was entirely funded by us. We do not ask photographers for any money or anything of that sort. I don't think that's a system that exists in India, at least not yet, and hopefully shall not enter the system. Photographers, if you're meeting publishers, please don't ever do that. But I think it's also important to see the different formats in which books have existed. Yes, you have books that are priced at 4,000, 5,000, and then they become extremely inaccessible for everyone to get. But you also have 1984 by Gauri Gill, which was distributed entirely for free, and then she decided to do a second edition, which we had at the bookshop, which was $300, and how do you make that happen? And I think it's the core of why you do the book that comes into the question here as well. Printing photographs is extremely expensive. That makes making photo books extremely expensive. But you have alternatives around it. We did an exhibition with Alana Hunt a year and a half ago, and we were presenting this one book, and Alana's practice has looked at the different complexities of violence in Kashmir. And she had made this one book, which was a response to the communication shutdown in Kashmir, where she'd actually distributed these little sheets of paper, and the entire project was called Paper Text Messages from Kashmir. And the idea was, if you cannot communicate with each other over the internet anymore or over messages anymore, write to each other. We can still have our own conversations. And it was a beautiful book. It was a limited edition book. By the time we went down to doing the exhibition, it was completely sold out. And we spoke to Alana, and I said, how can we not have this book if we're talking about an exhibition? How can we not talk about, this work? And between her and me, we decided that she was studying at JNU at the time when she did this project. And so we actually went to the stationery shop in JNU. We Xeroxed the entire book, and that became a different iteration of the book. But suddenly it was for 700 rupees, which is very difficult to get in a photo book format. But it was a Xerox. And so I think there are systems around this. I think it is really important. And there's no one over the other. I think all work has to coexist. Maybe there is some work that needs to be fragile, needs to exist within an artist book format, and requires a certain amount of economic value to it. And then there are other works that exist, which can be played with, can be experimented with. Rahab printed this book, Another Lens, if I'm not mistaken, and it's looking at the history, it's looking at the evolution of photography, it's looking at writing, it's looking at a lot of images that existed within archives. And that book was not a 4-color print because all the images were black and white. It was a 2-color print, which suddenly meant that the costs went down, which suddenly meant that students could access it. So I think there are systems around it, and I think that is why I propose the idea of, do we want the photo book or do we want the book? Because maybe in some spaces we can allow ourselves to really look at the why of what we're doing. Zine making is such a big part of the photo book system and culture right now, and that's more spontaneous. That's more great. I'm just going to make 10 copies right now, but if there are more people, I'll do another 10. So I think different systems are possible, and I think we need to break out of the restrictions we place upon photography as photographers to really liberate the book in that sense, to really allow it to be there in hands, and not think of it as this super fragile object, but also think about how we can then, can you take a book and not apply for a photo book grant, but apply for a research grant that's looking at history or looking at linguistics or looking at sociology instead, So I think we also need to kind of debunk a lot of this for ourselves, at least over here, because we don't have other avenues. So we've got to think more innovatively, maybe in that sense. Sure.
This conversation has really made me think that something that would be really useful is if there was a big research project about photography in the book, because we're all of us are finding out new things just listening to each other. So, and you know, you mentioned self-publish, be happy. Well, they're really good friends of mine, but I don't know how they operate. I don't know that. So if they're listening, but
sadly they're shut down now, right? Like they're not.
Are they
active
completely shut
anymore.
down?
No, they moved to Milan,
Milan,
and they're changing the thing, but they're still there.
Yeah, I thought
But
they were still
they're
there.
now co-publishing with Mac, I believe.
Yeah.
No, they haven't done. Yeah, well,
They have a program with Mac
Yeah.
going on.
but also it made me remember also Stephen Gill, who's a very interesting photographer, and I can't think the name of his publishing house, but he is a self-publisher. He's created his own publishing house.
Yes.
I don't know if he works with a designer. I also know him, and I don't know that answer. And his books are absolutely beautiful, and he seems to sustain himself with pretty high quality produced books. And I see him everywhere at the photo market, so there's nowhere he won't go. You know, he's not an elite thinking person.
Right.
And there's no one he won't talk to either. So that would be an interesting model to look at. But also an interesting thing happened to us when we were designing I wasn't designing, creating the book, putting ourselves in the picture, which you can see in the exhibition It's Time to See. I spoke to the publisher, who was the only woman publisher in the UK, because people were saying, you know, because you can't afford to print masses of photo books because you don't know if you're going to sell them. So I think we chose 700 that we would print, and I said, well, what are we going to do? You know, it's such a shame if it runs out, and if you want to print it again, you have to raise the money again and all this. And somebody said to me, why don't you ask her we can do open access PDF? I said, she won't do that. Of course she won't do that. You know, thinking in my head that would damage the sales of the book somehow. So I talked to her about it, and she said, yeah, do it. And I was really surprised. But of course it doesn't do anything to the sales of the book, because the people who are going to buy the book actually want the book. So now if you go to the Fast Forward website and you go to the Putting Ourselves in the Picture page, you scroll down and you can download a free PDF of the book, all beautifully designed in the same way. And all the books sold out, so it didn't have, it was there right from the beginning. So it didn't damage the sales, and it's available to anyone. And that made me super happy, because you know, it's an interesting thing, but it also adds to the point that somebody needs to do a research project. I mean, I might quite like to do it, but somebody needs to do a research project to find out about those things. So, you know, and then publish it again and online so people can read it. And it would be really interesting to see how this happens, and maybe expose some of these problems.
A lot of these problems. Just to add to that, I mean, the Monsanto book by Matthew Masson, like, it was exactly this. I mean, I don't know if he made the downloadable version accessible parallel, but it did happen because he just wanted his research around Monsanto and their work to be known. And so the book is not to be found in physical form anymore, but you can totally download it from, you know, Matthew's website. And because the research of the project and what you wanted to say and why you wanted to do it was really important. Just to add to like extended formats, sometimes bookmaking really helps with negating like physical barriers as well. So we're currently in the process of co-publishing a book with another collective from Pakistan, because we used to distribute their books in India, and sometimes books had to go from Lahore to New York to come back to Delhi, which is insane if you think about it. And so we were like, this just does not make sense, you know. So Nadia and I were having this conversation, and we said, let's just do this. You print this in Lahore, and I'm going to print this in Delhi, and then, you know, we can actually have it available, and it doesn't have to cover the cost of like this insane roundabout system of working to make one zine available. And similarly, we're right now in the midst of a co-publication project between Mexico and UK and India. You know, we were invited to be co-editors to this book by 1,000 words, and we just said, I mean, I was like, yes, this book is going to be available for maybe £5 or £10 or something like that in the UK, but by the time it comes to India, which it should, because if I'm a co-editor, I want the work to be available here, but it becomes insanely expensive, and then who am I speaking with? You know, And Ana, who's La Hydra from Mexico, had the same concerns, and we said, let's just print it in 3 parts of the world. So now we have 3 different perspectives from 3 different parts of the world working within photo book publishing. It's available and accessible locally, which means that hopefully, we're still working out the costing, but it should not cost you more than $500-600 or $800 to get this book, because it's all text. It does not need to cost you that much. So I think there are systems around it, and maybe more conversations like us sitting here and reimagining this space can lead to different ways of making books also.
No, thank you. I mean, again, there's so much that's here. I think one anecdote perhaps that is coming to mind also of like, how do you find ways of cutting costs that are possible and we don't know. I mean, one thing that a friend recently shared was they designed, and it's something that we found out by interacting with the designer, but it's there's a color background and then there are illustrations in black ink. And when we went to the printer, the designer told us you don't actually have to color print it because they designed it in a way that it's printed on color paper. So the actual designing,
Nice.
because apparently that is something that also needs to be done at the design stage and not simply at the printing stage. But I found that such a learning experience. But I mean, I want to come even thinking of, because one would think that a photo book has materiality and hence the downloadable version or an open access version is not very helpful, but perhaps perhaps there are more aspects or different reasons of every iteration of a photo book. Like, does a PDF have a different kind of versatility or a different use or a different way in which a physical photo book is actually, are there perhaps different uses of these different formats that make it more accessible? But I mean, I think I'd just like to maybe ask, why does, especially now, like why do we keep publishing, and why is it really necessary to keep publishing in today's times, especially in this
Because
country?
we're crazy.
We're
madly in love with the book. I think that's all I have to say.
But I think it's also like, I mean, the question really is that what kinds of books do we select to publish, and what kind of stories do we choose to tell? And going back, I think to Steve's concerns about it is communities need to be seeing them, and communities that have historically not had access to these books, whether they are Dalit, Bahujan, queer communities, and so how, as publishers and as bookmakers, what are the stories that we choose to tell, and then hence price the books, right? And
I mean, I feel it's a proactive way that each one who's involved in production takes as a understood decision, not just because I have to get to this, I will do this. You should innately feel so to be there. So in that case, it's not one person sitting and cut the cost, but and the idea is not to cut the cost, but it's to make it approachable. This is a totally different mindset itself. I'm not trying to get a cheaper paper, but I'm trying to get the ideal way that I can put it. So it's a perspective shift of how you see things, and that is something the person decides, not materiality.
Yeah.
The person then goes around to choose, so this is how I want it made or want it out there. So according to that, what can I do? And that again is a proactive thing of it could be either printing on a color paper or not spending on the ink, but that doesn't let go of the originality of the work. And let's say the post with Japanese books really didn't mind the quality of it, but it was to put it out there. And there were just few issues of provoking still stands the time. So it is the honesty of the person, basically, and so in that case, choice of story eventually reaches you. So, and it is, again, this is not a photography problem they're trying to solve. It's totally different. It's a community, how you approach it, or how you place yourself in response with artists in the society. It's not about I want to be the best artist. So it's how you perceive the problem, if at all there is, you acknowledge that it's a problem first. So people are happy to just put out books. For who? Why? So that plays a major role, and this printing the greatest of quality photos just doesn't mean that I give up on quality because I would want 1,000 more books. It's more of how I approach the whole issue and in that, as a byproduct, I make books also. Books should, in that case, be byproducts, and not the originality. I mean, the actual sense of what you're driving for. In that case, stories would be ideal of what you put out, and there's so much more avenues that you, and it's, yeah, I think, yeah. Because even though like, there are a few self-publishing, it's still not openly accessible. Like, to even know that these many publishers exist is almost impossible for most of the publishers that we're dealing with. So, yes, it is a very good first step, but what more and how more can we do is a very, very active and existing problem that we have to solve. And I don't think we're going to solve it, but at least address and acknowledge it, that this is an issue that we're trying to take head on.
Yeah, this is fascinating because it puts into question the idea of the author, right, and the authorial kind of notion.
Publishing kind of gives a free way for that because you're not bound by the big masters who pay. Just like in the mainstream cinema where you're a bigger producer, you have to adhere to their creative choice, which is very much decided by the market. And it's reactive to the market and not to the actual content that we're talking about. So self-publishing gives me that authority over it, which is a very bad word, but the control of it, of how I would want to, the work we perceive, work we distributed, work we seen, all of that is more of a personal choice, which is not outwardly driven, but me as a person, how I can function. But again, I need money for it, so that's a whole other thing that is.
Can't start that. Any last?
We should think
Yeah.
of wrapping up because
Sure.
it is,
We're going
or
on.
carry on the conversation at the lunch table.
Okay.
Yep.
Do we have time for a few questions? No, not
We
really.
were
Okay.
already quite
Sorry.
overboard and I think we're very close to lunchtime. But I'm sure if anybody wants to converse with the artists, you can connect with them, you can connect with everyone who's here on the panel, but just from closing remarks.
Okay. Well, thank you. Anyone has last thoughts?
Yeah, I'm fine.
I guess not.
Just read books, guys. Buy the books that are being made. That's the way to sustain it. Thank you.